This story was told to me by my grandmother a few years ago, and even though it's been a long time, I can't stop thinking about what my grandfather went through. What I'm going to tell you happened 20 years ago, and it was the last time my grandfather took one of his long routes on the road. My grandfather was a lifelong truck driver, a tough man used to loneliness and long hours behind the wheel. My grandmother always told me that he was never a man who was easily scared. Sure, there were times when he got nervous about certain things, but I never saw him truly scared. Or at least that's what I thought until that night. My grandmother told me that my grandfather had gone out to make a delivery of merchandise that was going to take him about 4 days in total. It was a common route, one he had made many times before. The first part of the trip went smoothly, but something strange began to happen on the second night, when he called my grandmother from a phone booth at a small roadside gas station. It was a cold night, and my grandfather, while covering himself with his jacket, called my grandmother as he usually did. But this time, his voice didn't sound like it always did. My grandmother told me that she noticed it immediately, as if he were scared. He told her that since he left town, at every stop he made, whether it was to get gas, buy a coffee, or just go to the bathroom, he had noticed a woman. According to my grandfather, this woman didn't come close or do anything out of the ordinary. She simply watched him from a distance, hidden in the shadows, dressed entirely in black. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence, that maybe it was someone else who was on the same route or that it was someone who lived near one of the stops. But when he saw her a second and third time at different gas stations in towns miles apart, something inside him began to get uneasy. He could never see her face properly, but he always knew she was watching him. That feeling of being watched accompanied him at each stop, and although he did nothing to approach her or talk to her, her mere presence made him nervous. I remember my grandmother telling me that on that call, my grandfather told her in a broken voice, "I don't know who that woman is, but she gives me a very bad feeling. She has a very heavy and negative vibe. I feel something strange when I see her, as if something bad was going to happen." My grandmother, as she always did, tried to calm him down. She told him that she would pray for him, that it was surely just a coincidence, that maybe he was tired and his mind was making him see things. But my grandfather was not convinced. He kept telling her that he didn't feel well, that this woman, even though he couldn't see her clearly, gave off a vibe that filled him with fear. He had never heard my grandfather talk like that before, as if he really feared this woman. After a while, my grandmother managed to calm him down a bit, telling him to rest and get back safely. My grandfather promised that he would, although he still sounded unsure. That was the last time my grandmother heard him alive. The next morning, my grandmother was awakened by a phone call. It was the police. They informed her that my grandfather had died in an accident that same morning. My grandmother, in a state of shock, could barely understand what they were telling her. According to the report, my grandfather lost control of the truck on a dangerous curve, went off the road, and died instantly. There was no time to do anything. For my family, his death was a hard blow. No one expected something like that. My grandfather was always a careful, experienced man, and that route was nothing new for him. However, when my grandmother began to tell what my grandfather had told her the night before, many in the family began to believe that the woman who had been following him was not just anyone. Over the years, I have heard many theories about what really happened. Some think that my grandfather was hallucinating from exhaustion, that perhaps his mind was no longer clear and that this led to the accident. But others, like my grandmother and some close relatives, firmly believe that the woman watching him was something else. Death, perhaps, waiting for the moment to take him. When I heard that story for the first time, I could not stop imagining my grandfather, alone on the road, with that feeling of being stalked. I thought about what it must have felt like to see that figure at every stop, knowing something wasn't right but not being able to do anything about it. My grandmother always said that he sensed that woman wasn't normal, and even though he could never see her clearly, he knew that her presence brought something bad. It's easy to dismiss stories like these, to think that they're just superstitions or the result of a tired mind. But after hearing what my grandfather experienced and how his journey ended, I can't help but think that maybe, just maybe, death was looking for him all along. Maybe that woman dressed in black was a warning, a harbinger of what was to come. Nowadays, every time I see a phone booth at an old gas station, I can't help but think of that call, of the fear my grandfather must have felt, and of the figure watching him from a distance. I wonder if, in some way, he knew what was going to happen, and if, in his final moments, he understood who that woman was and why she was following him. It's a story that left me with more questions than answers, but there's one thing I'm clear about. Sometimes, death comes in ways we don't understand, stalking us without us realizing it. And maybe, like what happened to my grandfather, there's no way to escape when it decides it's your time. A few years ago, something happened to me that, honestly, I haven't told many people about. I think partly because I still don't fully understand it. But today, I feel it's time to share it with you, because I know there are things that simply can't be explained. It was an ordinary night. I had left the city early in the afternoon, carrying a load that I had to deliver to a town several hours away. The trip was going well. The road was quiet, the weather clear, and although night routes always seem a bit stressful to me, I felt calm. I had a few hours left before reaching my destination, so I decided to stop at a small gas station on the outskirts of a town to stretch my legs and have a coffee. As I walked back to the truck, I ran into someone I didn't expect to see. It was Jack, a friend of mine since childhood. Seeing him, I couldn't help but be surprised. He was standing next to the gas station, leaning against a wall, looking at the ground. The first thing that caught my attention was his appearance. He looked very tired, as if he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were sunken, and his clothes were wrinkled. The strangest thing was that he didn't say anything when I approached. I spoke to Jack with a smile, telling him that I didn't expect to see him there, but he didn't answer. He just looked at me out of the corner of his eye without raising his head. Something wasn't right with his gaze. It wasn't that of someone who recognized a friend. There was something in his expression that deeply disturbed me, but I didn't want to insist. Maybe he was going through a bad time, so I offered him a ride. "I'll take you wherever you go." "Jack, come on," I said, and after a few seconds, he slowly moved towards the door of the truck and got in. During the first few minutes of the trip, I tried to start a conversation. I asked him how he was, what he was doing there, if everything was okay. But Jack didn't say anything. He just looked straight ahead, with the same anguished expression on his face. Every now and then, he let out a deep sigh, as if he was carrying a weight on his shoulders, but he didn't dare to say what was wrong. I let him be with his feelings, figuring that maybe he needed some space to process whatever he was going through. But honestly, the situation was making me more and more nervous. A few kilometers later, I received a call, and what happened next at that moment still gives me goosebumps. The phone rang, and without thinking much, I answered it. It was a woman's voice on the other end, and I recognized her immediately. It was Lisa, Jack's sister. "It's you, right?" she said, her voice breaking. "Listen, I need you to know something. Jack had an accident a few hours ago. They found him near the town, but he's not with us anymore." At that moment, the world seemed to stop. I couldn't understand what I was hearing. I asked her what he was talking about. Jack was standing next to me, glancing at my co-pilot, who was still sitting in the same place, silent. But something was wrong, very wrong. When I turned my head completely towards him again, what I saw froze me. Jack's face, or what used to be his face, had changed completely. His skin had deformed. His mouth was twisted in a grimace of indescribable suffering, and his eyes were filled with a desperation that was not human. He was trying to say something, moving his lips as if he wanted to speak, but only guttural sounds came out of his mouth, a kind of agonizing moans that showed a lot of suffering. It was not a voice. They were failed attempts to scream, to ask for help, but without words. The feeling of terror I felt at that moment is something I will never be able to forget. My heart raced, and without thinking, I let go of the steering wheel for a second, and that was the worst mistake I could have made. The truck lost control, and before I knew it, we were heading straight for some trees on the side of the road. Everything happened so fast that I didn't have time to react. The impact was brutal, and the last thing I remember is the deafening sound of twisting metal and shattering glass. When I woke up, I was surrounded by police officers and paramedics. My head was hurting like never before, and I didn't quite understand what had happened. The first thing I did was ask for Jack. I asked urgently, trying to get up, but one of the paramedics stopped me. "Sir, you were alone when we arrived. There was no one else in the cab." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I tried to explain to them that I had picked up Jack, who had been with me the whole time, but their looks said it all. They didn't believe me. They searched the entire truck, looking around, but they didn't find anyone. It was just me, trapped between the steering wheel and the seat, with a few bruises, but alive. Days went by until I was finally able to leave the hospital. No one in Jack's family understood how it was possible that I had seen him that night, when he had already been dead for hours. His accident happened before I found him at the gas station. They say they saw him for the last time in the afternoon before he disappeared, and all of that still echoes in my head. If Jack had died before, who did I pick up that night? Who did I take with me in the truck? Years have passed since then, and even though I try to move on with my life, that night never leaves my mind. I don't know what it was that I saw. I don't know if it was really my friend or something that took his form. All I know is that whatever it was, it didn't belong in this world. And even though I'm no longer here to say it, I feel that in some way Jack was asking me for help, but I couldn't understand it until it was too late. My name is Mario, and I've been behind the wheel for over 30 years, traveling routes of all kinds. From endless highways to dusty roads in the middle of nowhere. I'm not afraid of the long hours, the loneliness of the road, or the ghost stories you hear at every stop. The life of a truck driver teaches you to keep your feet on the ground. But that night was different, and I still don't know if what I experienced was real. It all started on a particularly difficult day. Business was not doing well. The company I worked for had been in financial trouble for months, and they had already laid off several drivers. I knew my time was numbered. The bills were piling up, and the bank had sent me a warning letter about my house. I faced losing everything, so when they called me with a last-minute job offer, I accepted without thinking twice. It was fast money and double the normal rate. The client, a guy with a quiet, mysterious voice, told me he had a load that needed to be taken urgently to a warehouse deep in the mountains. The only odd detail was that he didn't give me much information about the cargo. He just told me it was fragile and I needed to deliver it before dawn. What stood out most to me was the final warning. Do not open the trailer under any circumstances. Don't ask what it is. Just take the load and collect your pay. In any other situation, I would have said no. The job smelled illegal, and I knew something wasn't right. But I was desperate. I needed that money like never before, so I convinced myself it was none of my business what he carried in the trailer. The pay was too good, and in this business, sometimes it's better not to ask questions. I picked up the truck at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place that already had a bad feeling about it. The customer, a tall, thin man, was waiting for me with a smile that made me uncomfortable, as if he knew something I didn't. He gave me an envelope with half the payment in advance and told me the route. Remember, don't open the trailer and don't stop any longer than necessary. Just follow the road. I set off shortly before midnight. At first, everything seemed normal. It was a lonely route like many others I had done in my life, and the night traffic was light. But as I continued down the road, I began to notice something strange. A faint noise was coming from the trailer. At first, I thought it was the natural movement of the load. But as time went on, the noises became more persistent. It was as if something inside the trailer was scratching at the walls, trying to get out. I forced myself not to think about it. I knew that if I stopped or tried to inspect it, I would break the agreement, so I kept driving, even though a strange feeling began to grow in my stomach. I was alone on a dark road, with a load I knew nothing about, and the air inside the cabin felt heavy. It seemed like the cold was getting into my bones, even though the weather didn't justify that feeling. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the effects of the wind coming through some crack in the truck. But no, those whispers, they seemed like words. Words that I couldn't quite understand, but they echoed in my head as if someone was speaking very close to me, almost in my ear. A couple of hours later, I decided to stop at a gas station. I needed coffee to keep me awake. Also, the noises from the trailer had become more intense, soft, rhythmic bangs, as if something inside was calling my attention. As I was filling up with gas, I couldn't help but glance at the trailer. It looked normal from the outside, but that strange feeling wouldn't leave me alone. I went into the store to buy coffee, and the cashier, an older man, looked at me in a way that left me very concerned. "Are you coming from that direction?" he asked me, pointing back the way I had come. I nodded, trying not to look nervous. "Be careful, son," he said. "That road, it doesn't always lead only to where you think it will." I thanked him, though his words made me more uneasy than I already was. I got back in the truck, started the engine, and continued on my way, but the noises from the trailer didn't stop. The cold inside the cab was getting worse, and the whispers were getting clearer. I didn't understand the words, but I could feel the unease in the air, an anguish that was truly suffering. It wasn't until I came to a particularly sharp curve that the strangest thing happened. The truck's lights flickered, and for a brief second, I saw a shadow pass in front of the headlights. Someone or something was on the road. I slammed on the brakes, very scared. I stood still, looking ahead, but there was nothing, just the dark asphalt and the shadows of the trees. I shook my head, trying to concentrate. I must have been tired, exhausted from the tension of the trip, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something that will stay in my mind for life. In the back of the trailer, just at the edge of sight, a dark figure seemed to be watching me. I couldn't make out any details, but that presence was there, motionless, as if waiting for me to do something. I don't know how long I stared at it, but when I finally had the courage to turn around to look directly, it disappeared. The feeling that something was stalking me was stronger. The noises inside the trailer became a nightmare to hear. They were no longer just knocks. They were like footsteps, moving from one side to the other. When I finally reached the warehouse, an old, half-collapsed building in the middle of the mountains, I felt a strange relief. I wanted to get rid of that burden as soon as possible. The same man who had hired me was waiting for me, smiling again with that expression that made me feel uncomfortable. "Did you hear her?" he asked me, still smiling. I froze because I hadn't told him anything about the noises. "Hear what?" I answered, trying to seem indifferent. "The trailer. She sometimes gets restless on long trips." "Her?" I asked. The man simply continued smiling and handed me the rest of the payment without saying anything else. I didn't want to ask anymore. I didn't want to know more. I got in the truck and left there as quickly as I could. When I left that warehouse, I felt a mix of relief and anguish. I had done my job, collected my money, and everything should have been okay. But it wasn't. That trip left me with more than just a paycheck and a bad time. During the following weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about the noises of the trailer, the whispers I heard during the trip, and above all, that figure I saw through the mirror, that shadow that watched me from the darkness. At first, I tried to ignore it. I wanted to convince myself that it was just a hallucination. My mind was confusing me because I was tired. But then strange things started to happen. At night in my house, I could hear those same knocks I heard in the trailer. Sometimes when I turned off the lights, I felt a presence in the room, as if someone was watching me from the darkness. The worst was one night, while I was washing my face in the bathroom, I looked up at the mirror and for a second, I saw something behind me, a dark, motionless figure, exactly like the one I had seen on the road. I didn't want to look again. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and when I opened them, it was gone. But the fear, that feeling that something wasn't right, hasn't left me since. I know it sounds crazy, but I have the feeling that whatever was in that trailer, it didn't stay in the mountains. Something evil came with me. Since that trip, I have rejected all suspicious offers, no matter how tempting they may seem. Money isn't everything, especially when you feel like something is following you everywhere. Maybe what I carried that night wasn't just illegal merchandise, nor a simple prohibited cargo. Maybe, without knowing it, I became the transporter of something much darker, something that doesn't belong to this world. My name is Carlos, and I have been working as a truck driver for more than 15 years. Throughout all these years, I have traveled hundreds of routes, some longer than others, but I have always enjoyed the tranquility of being alone on the road. I was never a person who was carried away by ghost stories or strange things, but what happened to me on one of my trips, I can't get out of my head. This was about 3 months ago, on one of the routes I know best, Highway 57. I left Albuquerque bound for Santa Fe, a journey that, in good conditions, takes about 7 or 8 hours. As always, I preferred to leave at night to avoid traffic, so it was about 10 o'clock at night when I started my trip. The weather was fine, neither hot nor cold, and the road was clear. Everything was normal. After driving for a while, after midnight, I began to feel an uneasiness that I couldn't explain. It was like a sensation in my chest, a slight discomfort, but it made me nervous for no reason. The road was empty, as always at that time, and the cabin was empty. My trailer was the only place I could be quiet, but that night, something didn't feel right. I decided to stop at one of those little rest areas. There was no one there, which wasn't unusual. I parked, turned off the engine, and got out to stretch my legs. It was absolutely silent, and when I say absolutely, I mean there wasn't even the slightest sound. No crickets, no wind, nothing. It was just me, standing next to my truck, in the middle of nowhere, with this strange feeling that wouldn't let go. I told myself that maybe I was tired, that it was nothing, and that I should just get on my way. I got back in the trailer, started the engine, and drove off. But from the moment I got back on the road, something started happening. At first, I thought it was a problem with the dashboard light because the indicators were flickering very subtly. It wasn't a strong flicker, but I noticed that they weren't staying static like usual. They seemed to be shaking, almost imperceptibly, but enough to catch my attention. The strange thing was that everything else in the truck was working fine. The lights, the engine, everything was in order. But that detail of the dashboard bothered me more than it should have. I tried not to give it any importance and concentrated on driving. The road was dark and deserted, as always at that time, but something in the air felt different. By now, I was already quite restless, although I didn't quite understand why. A few minutes passed, and that's when the worst started. Suddenly, I heard a very low noise coming from the radio. It wasn't music, nor any interference, but something that sounded like a whisper. The strange thing was that the radio was off. Even so, the whisper continued, as if someone was speaking very close to me, almost in my ear. I couldn't make out what they were saying. It was so faint that at first I thought it was my imagination, but as the minutes passed, the sound wouldn't go away. I changed the station, even though the radio was off, just to see if it would go away. But nothing. The whispering continued. It was annoying because even though I barely heard it, I knew it was there. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more present it became. I started to get nervous. The dashboard was still shaking slightly, and now the sound on the radio was driving me crazy. I convinced myself that I should stop at the next gas station to check what was going on, because it wasn't normal. As I continued to drive, I noticed something else. I started to notice a smell of wet dirt inside the cabin. At first, I thought maybe there was a puddle or that it had rained somewhere on the road, but the weather was dry. It didn't make sense. The smell was strong, like it had just rained heavily, but there was no sign of water outside. I looked out the window, and the desert stretched out, dry as always. The scent of wet earth was as strange as the whisper on the radio. It wasn't an unpleasant smell, but it shouldn't be there. The air conditioning was off, the windows closed. There was no way that smell was getting into the cabin, but there it was. Finally, after driving a while longer with the feeling that something was following me, I came to a gas station. I pulled up next to 2 other trucks and turned off the engine, hoping that everything would go back to normal. But when the engine turned off, it was completely silent again. Like the previous stop, I couldn't hear anything at all. I decided to get out of the truck and went into the store to buy a coffee. Only the manager was there, an older gentleman who had seen me before. He asked me if everything was okay, and I don't know why, but I mentioned the smell of wet earth. The old man looked at me for a second, as if he knew something I didn't, and without changing his expression, he said, "That happens sometimes around here. A long time ago, there was a landslide near this area. Several cars were buried, and they say they never got them out." I didn't know what to say. I paid for the coffee and left the store, feeling a chill run down my spine. I stood outside smoking a cigarette, looking at my trailer as if I expected something weirder to happen, but nothing happened. The whispering on the radio had disappeared, and the smell of wet earth had dissipated. But the feeling that something wasn't right was still there. That night, for the first time in years, I decided to sleep with the windows closed and the door padlocked. I lay down on the bed in the cab, and even though I was tired, I couldn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I seemed to hear that whisper again, even though I knew it wasn't real. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I'm not one to believe in ghosts, but I can't deny what I felt either. And even though I've driven that route many times since then, I never stopped at that stop again. And I never heard that whisper again. My name is Ruben, and I've been driving a semi-truck for over 20 years. I've traveled the roads of Texas from end to end, and even though one gets used to all kinds of strange situations on the road, what happened to me a few months ago left me frozen. I still get a chill down my spine when I remember it. It was a September night around 1 in the morning. I had left Houston for Austin, and as I usually do, I was alone. I decided to take a secondary road, one of those that almost no one uses because it saved me time. It was not the first time I had been there, but it was not my favorite route. The road is lonely and full of curves. During the day, it doesn't seem so bad, but at night, when there are no lights other than those of your truck, things change. Everything was normal at first. I was driving quietly, listening to the radio so as not to fall asleep, when suddenly on one of the sharpest curves, I saw something on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was an animal or a shadow, but when I got closer, I realized it was a person. A man standing on the side of the road, as if he was waiting for someone or something. I didn't pay much attention. I thought it was someone who had been stranded and was perhaps waiting for a ride or a bus. It's not unusual to see people on the roads at night, but what I found strange was that the man didn't move or raise his hand to ask for help. He was just standing there, staring straight ahead as if he didn't care that I was passing by. I left him behind and kept driving, but something about that image made me uneasy. I don't know. It was the way he was standing, completely still as if he wasn't real. Still, I told myself that I didn't have to worry, that he was just some random man. About 10 or 15 minutes passed, and when I came to another sharp curve, there he was again. The same man, standing exactly the same, in the same posture on the side of the road. My heart started to beat fast. It was impossible that it was the same person. There was no way he had gotten there so fast. I thought he was confused, that maybe they were two men who looked a lot alike, but it was too much of a coincidence. I continued on my way, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, hoping to see him again, even though I knew I wouldn't. The atmosphere inside the cabin was tense, as if something else was going to happen at any moment. A few kilometers ahead, on a sharper curve, I saw him again. This time, he was in the middle of the road. I had to brake suddenly to avoid running him over. My heart jumped into my throat because the man didn't move. He was standing there, looking at me, or so I thought because I couldn't see his face clearly. The lights of the trailer illuminated him, but his face was in shadows. He didn't do anything. He just stood there without moving, as if he knew I wouldn't dare to move forward. I stood paralyzed for a few seconds, not knowing what to do. Should I get out? Ask him if he needed something? But a part of me told me that this was not a good idea. Something about this person was not normal. After what seemed like an eternity, the man stepped towards the side of the road, as if he was giving me permission to pass. I didn't stay there to take it in and sped off, leaving him behind, my heart beating a mile a minute. I didn't know if what I had just seen was a real person or if I had really just seen a spirit. But what worried me most was that I couldn't stop thinking about his face, or rather, the lack of it, because no matter how hard I tried, I could never see his face clearly. I kept driving without stopping until I saw a gas station on the road. I decided to stop because I needed to rest, clear my head, and try to understand what had happened. I got off the truck and went to buy a coffee. Inside the store was the manager, a man of about 50 who greeted me as if he had known me all his life. We started talking, and without thinking much, I told him what had happened to me. He listened to me in silence, and when I finished, he looked at me seriously. "You're not the first one to see him," he told me. "They say that man was run over years ago, right on one of those curves. He appears to truck drivers who pass by at night. Some say it's to warn them to slow down and not suffer what he went through, but others say that it's not the spirit of the deceased, but rather something else pretending to be him." I remained silent. I didn't know what to answer. The man just patted me on the shoulder and went to the counter, as if what he had told me was something completely normal. I finished my coffee quickly and returned to the truck, feeling a chill on my back that didn't leave me all night. Since then, every time I have to drive on that road, I do it during the day. But since I have no choice, I have to slow down at every curve, hoping not to see that figure again. Only sometimes, looking sideways at the mirrors, I think I notice a shadow moving behind me, but knowing that when I turn around there will be no one. I don't know if what I saw was real or if my mind played tricks on me because I was tired, but what I do know is that, since that night, I can't drive on that road without feeling like something is watching me. My name is Octavio, and I've been working as a truck driver for many years. I've traveled so many roads in Texas that I almost know them by heart. What I like most about this job is that I can be alone. I like to think while driving and enjoy the silence of the night. I'm not a guy who believes in weird things or ghost stories, although, to be honest, I've heard several out there. I've always been more of a down-to-earth person, until one night, something happened to me that I can't forget. It was a normal early morning like any other when I had to take the route from Dallas to El Paso. I already knew the road well, but that night I decided to take a detour that few people use. The truth is that I do it from time to time to avoid traffic or simply to vary the route. That road is lonelier because it's surrounded by hills and there are almost no cars. I like it because it's faster, but to be honest, there's something about it that has always bothered me. It was about 2 in the morning when I saw it, a light on the horizon in the distance. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I thought it was a light pole or maybe another car, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't any of those things. That light wasn't moving, it wasn't blinking. It was just there, fixed in the same place. I didn't know where it was coming from, but it didn't look normal, so I decided to slow down. The light was right on the side of the road, in a place where there shouldn't be anything. I started to feel uneasy, with a strange feeling in my chest, as if something wasn't right. There were no more cars, no signs of life, just that light floating on the side of the road, illuminating a small piece of land. I don't know why, but something in my head told me not to stop, so I stepped on the accelerator a little and continued on my way. When I left it behind, I felt relief, but the feeling of discomfort didn't go away. That image of the light kept hovering in my mind. I tried to get it out of my mind. I was trying to stop my thoughts, but I couldn't. It was like something was telling me that not everything was okay. I arrived in El Paso and parked at a rest stop to sleep a few hours before returning to Dallas. But even though I was tired, I couldn't sleep well. I closed my eyes, and the light reappeared in my mind. I felt like I was missing something, as if I hadn't seen everything I had to see. Even so, I kept telling myself that it was nothing, that it was just a firefly or some reflection of some sign or whatever. When dawn broke, I was ready to return. The day made everything feel more normal, less strange. Time passed, and when I got to the stretch where I had seen the light, I decided to slow down, just out of curiosity and to put an end to my doubts about what I saw that night. When I got to that point, I felt a knot in my stomach. When I saw it, a white cross on the side of the road, almost hidden among the bushes. I stopped the truck, got out, and walked towards the cross. It wasn't big and looked like it had been there for a long time. The wood was worn, and you could barely read what it said, but I did manage to make out a name and a date. 10 years ago, someone had died in that place. I stood there staring at it, not knowing what to think. The air was very cold, even though the sun had already risen, and everything felt strange. At that moment, a thought came to my mind. The light I had seen the night before, it wasn't a firefly or a sign. It wasn't something normal. I'm almost certain that that light was the spirit of someone who died in that place. Someone who hadn't been able to rest in peace. I'm not one to believe in such things, but that thought invaded me. I felt that that light was the spirit of someone who had died in that place. The person was trapped in some way, that his soul was still there, wandering the road, looking for someone to see him or remember him. I couldn't help but feel sad for that stranger. I got back in the truck, and as I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. I don't know if my mind had already suggested it to me or if I really saw it, but it seemed like a small light was shining right where the cross was. I didn't want to stop anymore. I continued on my way in silence, but with the feeling that I had witnessed something out of the ordinary, something completely paranormal. After that day, I never took that detour again. I hadn't told many people about my experience. I only mentioned what I saw to other truckers from time to time without expecting them to believe me. But deep down, I know what I saw. That light was the soul of someone who hadn't been able to rest, perhaps trapped in limbo. I don't know what kept him there, but I feel that, for a moment, I witnessed something that doesn't belong in this world.